Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, the fascinating thing about the West is that they tend to see the world through a lens of their own perspective, i.e., if they are pumping up to go to war, then the other side must be doing the same thing. Thus, the newest belief is that Russia is working with China to prepare for war.
Yeah, absolutely. And we thought this was an interesting topic of discussion because we can go through a lot of developments that have been going on, explain the rationale behind what's really happening, and really to be able to make sense and cut through the nonsense that the West perceives to be a reality. And a lot of it is because, as Ken says, they perceive the rest of the world behaves the way we do, and the rest of the world is itching to do the very things that we've done for decades. And because like China wants to become an hegemonic power, and China wants to become imperialistic, and Russia wants the Soviet Union 2.0, which of course is utter nonsense. And it's worth starting with regards to the issue of Ukraine, because for a long time, of course, there was all these theories that Russia couldn't last 5 minutes, couldn't fight a war, it would run out of ammunition. It was using chips out of washing machines to circumvent the lack of access to semiconductors, etc., all the stuff we've talked about and seen for a very long time. And then they kind of go, well, how's this war continuing? Because I was told 3 years ago it'd be over by now. So then they started coming up with all these ideas that the North Koreans were giving Russia a lot of arms and they weren't. Okay, subsequently, North Korea did provide military personnel to fight in Kursk region in Russia. They weren't in Ukraine. But there's always been these question marks about the aid that China was providing to Russia. And China's made the point, and people will say, well, they would say that. So frankly, who cares? It's not worth the paper, so to speak, that it's written on, that the Chinese were not assisting the Russians with regards to Ukraine itself. But what we do know categorically is the Russians and the Chinese share huge amounts of technology. There's no doubt that it is rapidly increased their capabilities in the area of hypersonics. I don't doubt Russia has provided Chinese with some degree of technological assistance, not entirely. But then, of course, there's always this ongoing fear in the West that China wants to go to war with Taiwan. Quite why they think China would like to go to war with Taiwan is debatable, because at the end of the day, the one difference between Ukraine and Taiwan is Taiwan's not surrounded by NATO sympathetic countries. It's an island. It's a long way from any theatre of conflict in relative proximity to NATO members, to the United States. The United Kingdom's part of that. And of course, there is no appetite in the Asia Pacific for countries to want to, in any way, shape, or form, start a proxy war on behalf of the United States and anyone else who might want to see that happen with China. So, of course, the natural logical conclusion then is, well, we also have to assess the ongoing relationship between the Chinese and the Russians, which is causing immense confusion, upset, anger, fear in the West, because they have seen this huge technological advancement. So therefore, there's kind of reports coming out in the Western media that suggests that in this case, Russia is actually helping China to prepare for some sort of conflict with Taiwan, and therefore they're going to train and equip Chinese airborne battalion, and also it's airdropping armored vehicles. This is all, I guess, to do with the fact that China's going to have an amphibious landing of the Taiwanese island, and therefore this would be why Russia is going to allow Beijing to have access to their training and technology in one of the areas where they then have to admit Oh, but Russia is still capabilities are better than those of the Chinese military. Not everything else Russia's useless at, but they are better than everyone else with regards to this because Russia has airborne troops. So it's this idea because it's, I'll scratch your back and you scratch mine because, Moscow's been dependent on China for all these dual use items. Not that Russia has the resources and the capability to manufacture all the weapons it needs for the Ukraine war itself. And therefore, because, when we scratch your back down, then Beijing is going to actually utilize Russia's battlefield expertise to build this modern army that with capabilities that are better than the US. The US's military is worse than useless, as a recent GAO report stated very clearly, and that included game changers that ironically were sent to Ukraine to win the war for Ukraine, which of course has failed to materialize. And there's all this Western idea about what China's going to do to win a war over Ukraine, over Taiwan, sorry. And they produce all this documentation, and it gets reinforced by this belief. Well, there's this deepening alliance between China and Russia, and they're going to forge this new world order, so to speak, that's going to counter us, the West, and it's going to end our hegemony, and it's just total fear and panic. And of course, there's an argument that says if the West fears this, and the argument is, and if you push China enough, they will take military action. They've made that point very clear, that level of cooperation between Russia and China not only strengthens the alliance between them, but it means they're starting to assert themselves militarily, and that terrifies the United States, the United Kingdom, and certain NATO members. Some NATO members just perceive what China's doing as irrelevant to them, but it certainly is causing immense concern. And I'll give way to Ken, and then we can carry on with this discussion.
Yeah, something I came across, and I mean, it just shows the lunacy of their hyperbolic, paranoia, because this is 2024. The Sino-Russian Arctic exercise, September 2024. Pacific Air and Sea Patrols in 2024. South China Sea Drills in July. Joint Submarine Patrol in August. And then, of course, the Maritime Interaction 2025, a joint sea venture just in August. So the West has had the opportunity to speak out about the getting together between the two nations at this time in history, but they're doing it now out of just complete fear. And it's kind of fascinating because it seems to happen right when the UN talks where all these leaders were out there, and President Trump had the the audacity to say that, well, if a real country had attacked Ukraine, the war would have been over in a week. But instead, Russia is not strong enough to deal with it. Well, that just tells you that the West never truly understood what Russia's side of this Ukraine conflict has been all about. It hasn't been about simply taking over the country and forcing them into submission. An SMO is an SMO. It's got specific objectives, and the hope, of course, is that the objectives would be achieved sooner than later, of course, over the past 3 years. But Russia is going to continue on piece by piece until those objectives are achieved. Not to take over the entire country unless they absolutely have to. And it's that mindset between Europe, NATO, the United States over Ukraine is the same belief that they appear to be having with China over Taiwan.
Yeah, and the thing is, of course, there's all these contradictory statements where they talk about, well, if there was a war in future between China and Taiwan, you know, Russia's got these enormous resources. And then remember, Russia's lost the war 3 years ago because their military defense industry can't manufacture anything. But now apparently it can manufacture huge amounts of weapons for China to support them in a war. The question they're asking themselves is how long do they seriously think a war with Taiwan is going to last? Bearing in mind that it's very easy to cut off the power supply and energy requirements for Taiwan by a blockade. And also, there are power lines that stretch from the Chinese mainland to Taiwan. China could just cut them off very readily. So it's an entirely different situation. It bears no resemblance to the war in Ukraine. And of course, yes, there might well have been intelligence that's been leaked or stolen or somehow that suggests, that maybe as much as a year ago, Russia was selling all these amphibious vehicles and anti-tank guns and armored personnel carriers to China. But why does that necessarily have to have anything to do with Taiwan? It doesn't. It doesn't. And really, in financial terms, the contractual agreements are chicken feed. I mean, yes, I don't doubt that all the time, and we know this, that China and Russia have military drills. They cooperate, they train together. But that doesn't mean it specifically relates to any future conflict. But from the Chinese and Russian perspective, it keeps the West on their toes. It makes them, if they believe that's a threat, they're less likely to interfere in that part of the world to cause a conflict in the first place. That's the very important part of this, because if they indeed fear this and they think, well, this is two nuclear powers now joining forces, therefore we're going to have to be a little bit careful what we do with Taiwan in the future and how we try to galvanize the likes of the Philippines and other nations in the region in trying to create this kind of quasi mini NATO, which of course is nothing like NATO and will never be in any way, shape, or form. Now, tellingly, of course, the Russians and the Chinese have said nothing about this. Now, the West will immediately go, well, that therefore proves what we're saying is correct. It doesn't. But yes, military cooperation between China and Russia goes way beyond what is publicly acknowledged by both sides. That's absolutely true. But why wouldn't they do that? That's like the West is going to advertise everything it does militarily either on that basis. And therefore they will have cooperation, but the extent to which that cooperation enters into the territory of providing military hardware, because I very much suspect that the Chinese have their own amphibious vehicles, etc. already. I don't think there's a need for them per se to have them, and why would it necessarily relate to Taiwan? But then it's just this obsession in the West that China wants to go to war with Taiwan. Some of it's propaganda to try and create the bogeyman in the Asia Pacific so they can start a NATO there to face off and try and suppress China, of course, like they did with creating NATO after World War II and therefore have Russia as the perennial bogeyman. It's exactly the same rationale and reasoning behind it, but they've got to the point now that they actually think this is reality. Oh, and the fact that they held, and I think it is annually, they have over maybe approaching 15, 20 joint exercises every year. That's on land, it's in air, it's at the sea, it's everywhere. And of course, the same argument applies to what Russia does with Belarus. I mean, and yes, at the recent Russia-Belarus so-called Zapad 2025 war games, Russia did demonstrate some equipment that they had from China. I mean, and China demonstrates cooperation out with Russia. I mean, so it does. It's the constant guessing that means that at least cooler heads inside the West are more receptive to the fact that we have to be extremely careful we don't push Beijing too far, because I've said this before, China is far less tolerant than Russia is. People might find that impossible to believe, but they are, and if they're really pushed, they'll take far more aggressive and affirmative action immediately than what Russia would do correspondingly. So I don't think if there was an issue of an SMO or a war with China, it's war straight off, and that's the end of it. and they'd have no qualms whatsoever to put that in place. So that's something else that is deeply concerning to the West. But at the end of the day, we're back to this point. China and Russia's military technology is light years ahead of what the West has, and increasingly elements in the West acknowledge this. And therefore, on that basis, they should be rather concerned with regards to their capabilities. But this also feeds into the fact that there is a belief in the West that China and Russia have been providing military technology and hardware to Iran over and above the Iranians having S-400s, as one example, where there's a belief after the recent Israeli-Iran sort of 12-day war that China was actually providing assistance to Iran in surface-to-surface ballistic missiles, etc., etc., and therefore it just feeds into this idea that, well, these countries are sharing this military technology with our adversaries, but the big difference is they're both nuclear powers, and we're back to this point. The United States does not want to lock horns with countries like China, Russia directly because they are nuclear powers and they possess a far more serious threat than them previously having conflicts with countries like Iraq, etc., or trying to enter Afghanistan and failing miserably to do so. So there is definitely cause for them to have concerns. There is cause for concern about their military capabilities and how those military capabilities are increasing year after year. But the rationale behind what they intend doing with it is certainly incorrect at times. But at the end of the day, from China and Russia's perspective, it serves a purpose. And whilst they live in that fear and whilst they are anxious about what they may do, then it tends to curb even the most over enthusiastic members of the military in the West from deciding that maybe we can accelerate our support of Taiwan in terms of future aggression with China, or what they perceive to be aggression anyway.
I think the key things I want to focus on here at the tail end of our podcast is um, the United States and Europe are some of the biggest absolute hypocrites in the world. They're the ones who are supplying all of the weapons to Ukraine to fight as a proxy against Russia. Then, of course, arms were sent, not just missiles and that, but arms were sent to Israel, who eventually had to get the United States to intervene and attack Iran, as part of a joint venture. So for them to say and speak out against two allies, strong allies for more than a decade, or increased alliance between Russia and China, is just preposterous to the end. And one of the things that stands out about this document from the think tank was their belief, and this is that lens of perspective again. Moscow and Beijing are seeking to forge a new global order to counter the West and disrupt the status quo. Well, the reality is they're not forging a new global order to counter the West. They're more along lines to simply ignore the West, disconnect from the West as much as possible, and any nation that wants to join us in this is absolutely fine. And it fights against this 500-year colonial hegemonic belief that Europe and the United States have, that any nation that seeks to bring in another nation or alliance, that it's a colonial based thing. Beijing and Moscow are the two superpowers, and everybody else are vassals to them. No, the old world order is vassalage. The new world order is multipolar, where Modi comes and meets with Xi as brothers, not as a vassal before the king. And, it's that mindset that is going to keep the West completely in decline. And they're not going to recognize that certain events are going to lead to a much different outcome than their intelligence services and their intellectual believe it's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got an interesting one, which I think is worth sharing from your perspective, Ken. I mean, you were in the military, so in the US. So how was the perspective? I mean, I guess back then China wasn't really a concern at all, but in your time, what was, the feeling about Russia and the threat it posed and its capabilities, and was China even mentioned at all? I mean,
Well, it's a great question because I was in the military from 88 to 96. And Russia had, during that time, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union took place. And it was more along the lines of the US didn't care. The Soviet Union had fallen. They were not seen as a threat. And really, they did not perceive them a threat until uh, Putin started cleaning house, kicking out all the Western backed oligarchs, forcing them to capitulate. And then, of course, solidifying the borders and alliances. And that's really when Russia started becoming seen as an enemy again. But probably from 91 to 2004, 2003, Russia, for all intents and purposes, wasn't even on the map.
yeah, I mean, that might not, that to some people, that won't be a surprise, but we're just trying to reiterate why the perception has changed so much in recent years. And it's not entirely surprising, but a lot of it is just based on the idea these two powers represent this challenge to US hegemony, to this old world order post Bretton Woods, at the end of World War II. And therefore, on the basis of that, their motivations must be world domination. We have to challenge this world domination, because if it's not us dominating the world, it's someone else, and it's going to be them. And they continue to totally misinterpret the intentions of both countries. But the problem is it resulted in Ukraine war happening because they misunderstood and misinterpreted things. And I think subsequently, you can argue it could also end up resulting in some conflict happening with Taiwan because they totally misunderstood and misread the room as to what China and Russia's intentions are. And that's the risk. So this fear is legitimate from their perspective. By and large, it's not going to be realized, but there is a risk that this could escalate into a problem. And China will take military action if they have to. They've made the point there, and they're not idle in their threats, and they will do so. And the United States knows this. And I think this time, though, it's a very different situation between Russia and Ukraine than China and Taiwan. But clearly, they are seeing developments between Russia and China, which gives them reason for and to have fear that. But are they preparing for war in that sense? No. What they're doing is they're trying to avoid war by putting sufficient deterrence in place to make the United States walk away and realize we could have another Vietnam here, we could have another Afghanistan, or even though we're never going to publicly admit it, we could have another Ukraine.
Yeah, I think Taiwan is a little bit different egg to crack, but take a look at what Beijing has, how they have treated Hong Kong. Now, of course, Hong Kong, there was the agreement, I think, in 99, where the British gave it back, and it was going to slowly be transitioned over the course of 20, 30, 50 years. But then the United States got involved, assisted in, the rebellion that took place. China stepped in. But since then, Hong Kong has not been this slave providence. They've not been under this communist thumb. For the most part, things have been allowed to continue moving forward just under the acknowledged dominion of Beijing. And I think truly, when you take a look at how they treated Hong Kong, this is how they want to treat Taiwan. In essence, what you are part of China, you have a significant and important independent objective under the auspices of the umbrella of Beijing. We're not going to come in and put our boot down and stamp things out, but you have to acknowledge that now you serve under Beijing and not under the United States. And of course, getting the bases and other Western military locations out of Taiwan, that would be an obvious thing. But for the most part, China does not seek to destroy its own people and its own land in order to pacify it. And I think that's where the West truly fails. And even Taiwan, up to a point, you see some of their leadership, they acknowledge and recognize that that's the truth as well.
Yeah. So I think from my perspective, that's a good point to stop. As ever, we're not here to discuss everything. It's to provide a concise assessment of the situation and some of the key points, so people can go away and think about this in more detail. Because if we do it for 2 or 3 hours, hardly anyone will listen. So there's no point doing that.
Absolutely. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.